There are two shows about ordinary men who decide to do terrible things and then spend years telling themselves they had no choice. One is set in the New Mexico desert, under a sky so bright it looks like the world has nothing to hide. The other is set in the Missouri Ozarks, on a lake so still it looks like nothing bad could ever happen there. Both settings are lies. Both shows are about a man who walks through a door he cannot walk back through, and what happens to everyone standing near him when he does. Breaking Bad ran for 5 seasons and became one of the most analyzed dramas ever made. Ozark ran for 4 and was watched by more people than almost anything else on Netflix. They are not the same show, but they are asking the same question. When a man decides his survival justifies everything, how far does everything actually go? Tonight, we find out. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let's get started. Section 1. The Setup. 2 ordinary men, 2 impossible situations, and the first choice that changed everything. There is a particular kind of television character that emerged in the first decade of the 21st century and that has not gone away since. The character is usually male. He is usually middle-aged. He is usually living a life that is smaller than he believes he deserves, working a job that does not reflect his intelligence, surrounded by people who do not fully appreciate what he is capable of. He has a family he loves in the abstract and resents in the specific. He has ambitions that were quietly shelved somewhere in his 30s and that he has never fully made peace with. He is not a villain when the show begins. He is not even particularly dangerous. He is just a man sitting at a desk or standing at a stove or driving a car on a Tuesday morning, feeling the low, steady pressure of a life that has not gone the way he planned, looking for the moment when something changes. And then, something does change. And the rest of the show is about what that change reveals about who he actually was underneath the unremarkable surface he had been presenting to the world for decades. Walter White and Marty Byrde are both versions of this character. They share the same basic template: middle-aged, highly intelligent, professionally undervalued, emotionally constricted men who find themselves in situations that require them to act outside the law, and who discover, in the process of acting outside the law, that they are considerably better at it than they were at being ordinary. That discovery is the engine of both shows. The question both shows are asking, from the very beginning, is not really whether Walter or Marty will survive their respective crises. It is what surviving will cost them, and whether the cost will change them, and whether the change was already there waiting inside them before the crisis ever arrived. Both shows answer that question differently, with different levels of optimism about human nature, and different ideas about what ordinary men are actually made of when the pressure finally arrives. Walter White is a 50-year-old chemistry teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He has a pregnant wife named Skylar, a teenage son with cerebral palsy named Walt Jr., and a job that requires him to stand in front of teenagers every day and teach a subject he once loved at a level far below what his training prepared him for. He is also, as we learn in the first episode, a man who was once a founding member of a chemistry research company called Gray Matter Technologies, a company that went on to become extraordinarily successful after Walter sold his share for $5,000. Under circumstances the show explores in careful pieces across all 5 seasons. He has a second job, working at a car wash to help pay his family's bills. He is pale and thin and slightly hunched, and his students do not respect him. And his brother-in-law Hank, a DEA agent, makes affectionate jokes at his expense at family gatherings. He is, by every visible measure, a man who has been reduced by life to a version of himself he can barely stand to look at in the mirror. And then, he is diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. He is given 14 months, possibly 2 years if the treatment works. He does not have the money for the treatment. He does not have savings. He has a family that will be financially destroyed when he dies. And so, when his DEA brother-in-law takes him on a ride-along to a methamphetamine lab bust, and Walter spots an old student named Jesse Pinkman escaping through a window, Walter makes a decision. He goes to Jesse. He tells him he wants to cook meth. Not forever, not as a career, just enough to make enough money to leave his family secure before the cancer kills him. He frames the decision to himself and to us as a practical choice. He has a terminal diagnosis. He has a skill set that happens to be relevant to the production of a highly profitable illegal substance. He needs money. The math is straightforward. He is a chemistry teacher. He will cook the best meth anyone has ever seen. He will make his money and provide for his family. And then he will die. Simple, clean, temporary. That is the first lie. And the rest of Breaking Bad is the slow, meticulous, painfully detailed unraveling of that lie, across 5 seasons and 62 episodes, until the man standing in a meth lab in the New Mexico desert in the final season has almost nothing in common with the pale, frightened chemistry teacher who knocked on Jesse Pinkman's door in the pilot, except the face and the name. Marty Byrde is a financial advisor in Chicago, Illinois. He's in his early 40s, financially comfortable, living in a large suburban house with his wife Wendy and his 2 children, Jonah and Charlotte. He works for a legitimate investment firm. He coaches his son's soccer team. He drives a clean car and wears sensible clothes, and attends school events, and is, to all outward appearances, the living embodiment of the upper-middle-class Midwestern professional life. He is also, as we learn in the first episode of Ozark, quietly laundering money for the second-largest drug cartel in Mexico. He has been doing this for years. His business partner, Bruce Little, brought him into the operation, and Marty, who had the financial intelligence to make it work, had been running the numbers ever since, skimming enough off the top to keep both of them comfortable, and hoping, in the way that people who make terrible decisions tend to hope, that the situation would eventually resolve itself without anyone getting hurt. It does not resolve itself. Bruce is caught stealing from the cartel, and the cartel, represented by a man named Dell, a fixer of the specific quiet brutality that crime dramas use to signal that the rules of ordinary life no longer apply, executes Bruce and his associates in front of Marty, and gives Marty a choice. He can die now on the floor of a parking garage in Chicago, or he can make a proposal. Marty, who has perhaps 30 seconds to come up with a reason to be kept alive, tells Dell that he can launder $500 million in 5 years in the Ozarks of Missouri. He has no plan. He has not thought this through. He is making it up in real time to stay alive. Dell agrees, and Marty Byrde, within days, has moved his entire family to a lake town in rural Missouri and begun the project of building a money laundering operation from scratch in a place where he knows no one and understands nothing about the local criminal ecosystem he is about to enter. The contrast between these 2 first choices is one of the most revealing things about the different kinds of stories these 2 shows want to tell. Walter White chooses. He is not forced. He has a terminal diagnosis, yes, and a real financial problem, yes. But nothing is holding a gun to his head when he goes to Jesse Pinkman's door. He has other options. His former gray matter partner offered to pay for his cancer treatment earlier in the same episode. His brother-in-law works in law enforcement and could potentially have helped him if Walter had wanted to go that route. Walter has options. He chooses not to take them. He chooses the option that lets him be in control. that lets him be the one who solved the problem, the one who made the money, the one who proved that his intelligence and his capability were real and significant. The choice to cook meth is, underneath the financial justification, the choice of a proud man who cannot stand to owe anything to anyone, and who has found a way to frame his pride as necessity. Marty Byrde, by contrast, is already in the criminal world when Ozark begins. He did not make a dramatic choice at the start of the show. He made a quieter, more gradual series of accommodations years earlier, each one small enough to rationalize individually, and collectively large enough to have produced the situation he is now in. He is not a proud man in the same way Walter is. He is a practical man. His choice in the parking garage, the choice to stay alive by proposing an audacious financial scheme he has not planned, is not a choice born of ego. It is a choice born of survival instinct and financial intelligence, and the particular kind of cold competence that both saves and damns him across 4 seasons. He is not trying to prove anything about himself. He is trying not to be shot in a parking garage in Chicago. The motivations are different from the beginning, and the different motivations produce different men, and the different men produce different shows. And understanding that difference is the key to understanding what Breaking Bad and Ozark were each, ultimately, trying to say. There is something else worth noting about these two setups, something that the shows use to establish tone in their very first hours. Breaking Bad opens with Walter driving a recreational vehicle through the New Mexico desert in his underwear, with a gun in his hand and 2 bodies in the back, and a police siren in the distance. Before we know anything about him, before we know why he is here, or what he has done, or what his name is, we see him like this: frantic, undignified, out of control, making a video confession to his family because he thinks he is about to die. The show does not begin with his competence. It begins with his panic. And then it reverses. The rest of the series, from that opening image backward through the pilot and forward through 5 seasons, is the story of how a man in his underwear in the desert becomes something genuinely terrifying. The show trusts us to make the journey because it has already shown us where it ends up. Ozark opens differently. It opens with Marty giving a monologue directly to camera about the nature of money. He talks about it calmly, analytically, with the tone of a man explaining something he has thought about carefully for a long time. He is not in his underwear. He is not in a desert. He is composed and articulate and clearly in possession of himself. And then the scene cuts to the parking garage and Dell and the executions, and we understand that this composed, analytical man has been operating inside something catastrophic. And the composure is not a character trait. It is a coping mechanism. The show opens with a man who has already decided what he is. Marty Byrde does not transform across 4 seasons the way Walter White does. He reveals. The monster, or something approaching a monster, was already assembled before the show began. What Ozark does is strip away the surfaces, one by one, until the man underneath them is visible. This distinction between transformation and revelation is perhaps the deepest structural difference between the 2 shows, and it produces almost everything else that is different about them. Breaking Bad is a tragedy in the classical sense. It takes a man with genuine virtues, genuine love, genuine intelligence, and watches those virtues corrupt into something that produces only destruction. Walter White at the beginning of the show is, in important ways, a good man in difficult circumstances. By the end, he is something else entirely. The tragedy is that the something else was in him all along, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Ozark is closer to a thriller. It takes a man who has already made his compromises and watches him double down on them, expand them, build an entire criminal infrastructure on top of them, and eventually lose almost everything that made the original compromises feel worth making. It is not asking whether Marty is good or bad. It already knows the answer. It is asking how far a bad man will go before he runs out of road. Both are compelling questions. Both produce excellent television. But they are different questions, and the different questions require different kinds of watching. And the experience of finishing Breaking Bad versus finishing Ozark is, as a result, radically different. Breaking Bad ends with grief. Ozark ends with something harder to name. Not quite satisfaction. Not quite horror. Something closer to the feeling of watching a machine finally stop running, after you have been watching it run for a very long time, and have slowly understood that the machine was broken from the beginning. The two ordinary men, the chemistry teacher and the financial advisor, the man with the cancer diagnosis and the man with the cartel problem, are the starting points of two of the most watched dramas of the last 20 years. They share a template. They share a question. Everything else about them is different. And the difference, traced carefully across both shows, tells you something not just about television, but about what happens to a man when the life he has been living turns out to have a different floor than he thought it did. When the ordinary gives way, and the thing underneath it is finally, unavoidably, visible. That is where both of these shows begin. An ordinary man, a catastrophic situation, and a first choice that turned out to be less of a beginning than it appeared. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The two men and their two impossible first choices established everything that came after. But neither of them went through what followed alone. And the women standing beside them paid a price the shows took their time making visible. Section 2. The Wives. Skylar White and Wendy Byrde, and what it costs to stay. There is a particular kind of scene that both Breaking Bad and Ozark return to again and again across their combined 9 seasons. And it is not the scene most people remember when they think about either show. It is not the cooking scene, or the money-counting scene, or the confrontation with the cartel. It is a quieter scene, a domestic scene. A scene set in a kitchen, or a bedroom, or a car, where a wife is sitting across from her husband and trying to figure out, with the information available to her in that moment, whether the man she is looking at is still the man she married. The scene happens in different forms in both shows. It happens early and it happens late. It happens when the wife is still trying to understand what is going on. And it happens again when she understands completely and has decided, for reasons that each show takes its time laying out, to stay anyway. The scene is never comfortable. The scene is never resolved. And the two women sitting across from their husbands in those kitchens, Skylar White and Wendy Byrde, are two of the most important and most differently understood characters in the history of prestige cable drama. They are not the same woman. They are not even close to the same woman. And the difference between them is one of the clearest signs that Breaking Bad and Ozark are, underneath their shared template, fundamentally different kinds of stories, with fundamentally different ideas about what women in impossible marriages are allowed to be. Skylar White is introduced in the pilot of Breaking Bad as a woman who is heavily pregnant, creatively engaged with an online business selling vintage items. Sharp, organized, and clearly the administrative center of the White household. She manages the finances. She tracks the budget. She notices when things do not add up. She is, in the pilot, warmer and more openly affectionate than Walter, who is already carrying the low-grade resentment of a man who has been quietly disappointed by his life for too long. She rubs sunscreen on his back at his birthday party with a tenderness that he receives but does not quite return. She is trying. She is present. She is not a woman who has checked out of her marriage. She is a woman who is still, at the start of the show, genuinely invested in the man she is married to and in the life they have built together. And then, Walter starts lying to her. He lies about where he is going in the evenings. He lies about money. He lies about a second cell phone she finds in his jacket pocket. He lies about the cancer diagnosis for weeks, withholding the most significant medical information about himself while she is 8 months pregnant with his child. He lies with the specific, practiced fluency of a man who has decided that his autonomy is more important than her ability to make informed decisions about her own life. And Skylar, who is not stupid, who has been managing this household's books for years, starts noticing. The noticing is careful at first. She asks questions. She tracks inconsistencies. She waits. She is doing what intelligent people do when the person they trust most starts behaving in ways that do not make sense. She is gathering evidence. She is trying to construct a version of events that she can live inside. The version of events she eventually constructs is wrong, because the truth is so far outside what she could reasonably have anticipated that no reasonable person would have arrived at it without help. But the process of constructing it, and then having it collapse, and then constructing another one, and then having that one collapse too, across the first 3 seasons of the show, is the story of Skylar White being slowly forced to understand that the man she married has been replaced by something she does not recognize and cannot reach. And the audience's response to this process, almost universally, was to be irritated by her, to find her cold, to find her obstructive, to wonder why she could not simply accept what Walter was doing and support him the way a good wife was supposed to. The response was so pronounced, so widespread, and so ugly that Anna Gunn, the actress who played Skylar, wrote an essay about it in the New York Times in 2013, describing the harassment she received from viewers who blamed her, personally, for the character she was playing. She described being sent death threats. She described viewers who had decided that Skylar's reasonable, intelligent resistance to her husband's criminal enterprise made her the villain of the show. Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad, has been explicit in interviews about what he thinks that response revealed. He said that the hatred of Skylar was a reflection of how successfully the show had done its job of placing the audience inside Walter's perspective, and that the audience, once inside that perspective, had adopted Walter's resentment of her as their own. They wanted Walter to succeed. They had invested in him, and Skylar was the person standing between Walter and his success. So they hated her for it. Gilligan also said, more pointedly, that the response revealed something about how audiences treat women who refuse to be compliant, who ask questions, who say no, who insist on their own moral clarity in the face of enormous pressure to surrender it. Skylar White was not the villain of Breaking Bad. She was one of the only people in the entire show who saw clearly what Walter was becoming and refused to pretend otherwise. The audience punished her for it. What Skylar eventually does, after seasons of resistance and confusion and a brief affair with her boss Ted Beneke that was partly genuine attraction and partly an act of marital warfare, is cross the line herself. She launders money through the car wash. She becomes complicit. She does not do it because she has been converted to Walter's worldview. She does it because she has run out of options that protect her children. and because she has understood, by the fourth season, that leaving is not a simple act when the man you are leaving is capable of what Walter has shown himself capable of. She is afraid of him. She says this out loud in one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the show, sitting by the pool, telling her sister Marie that she is simply waiting for the cancer to come back, waiting for the DEA to catch him, waiting for something outside herself to resolve a situation she cannot resolve from inside it. She has given up on saving him. She is trying to save herself and her children. And the audience, by this point, has largely given up on her too, because her despair is not entertaining and her fear is not glamorous, and she is refusing to perform the role of the loyal, supportive wife that the show, or at least a significant portion of its audience, had been quietly expecting from her. Wendy Byrde is a different animal entirely. She is introduced in the Ozark pilot as a woman who is, at the moment the show begins, having an affair. Her husband Marty knows about it. She does not know that he knows. Their marriage is already broken before the cartel crisis arrives, already operating on the basis of mutual secrets and managed distance. She is not Skylar White in the early seasons, trying to understand what her husband is hiding. She is a woman who has her own hidden life, her own interior territory that her husband does not have access to. When the crisis arrives and Marty tells her, on the drive to the Ozarks, what he has actually been doing with their money for the past several years, her response is not confusion. It is anger. The specific anger of a woman who has been kept out of a decision that her entire life now depends on, who has been treated as a variable in someone else's calculation, rather than as a partner whose consent might have mattered. And then Wendy Byrde does something that Skylar White never quite managed to do in 5 seasons of Breaking Bad. She decides to get involved. Not reluctantly, not under duress. She decides, with the specific ambition of a woman who has been underestimating herself for years, that she is good at this. That the political instincts she developed years earlier, working for a political campaign in Chicago before her marriage and her children and her suburban life quietly reduced her, are directly applicable to the world she has just been dropped into. She starts building. She recruits a local pastor. She targets a riverboat casino as a laundering vehicle. She cultivates relationships with local politicians. She lies to law enforcement with a fluency and a composure that surprises even Marty, who had considered himself the competent one. She becomes, across 4 seasons of Ozark, not the reluctant accomplice of a criminal husband, but something closer to a criminal in her own right, operating with her own agenda, making her own decisions, occasionally making decisions that are larger and more consequential than anything Marty had planned. The most significant of these decisions comes in the 3rd season, when Wendy arranges the death of her own brother, Ben. Ben Davis is Wendy's younger brother, a man with bipolar disorder who has come to stay with the Byrde family in the Ozarks, and who has, in the course of his stay, become entangled in the cartel's operations and threatened to expose everything. Wendy loves Ben. This is not in question. The scenes between them across the 3rd season are the most emotionally honest scenes in the entire show. He is charismatic and damaged and funny, and she has spent her whole life trying to protect him from the consequences of a disorder that makes him impossible to protect. And when the cartel tells her that Ben is a liability that needs to be eliminated, Wendy makes the choice. She tells the cartel's fixer, Helen Pierce, where Ben is. Helen Pierce has him killed. Wendy then tells Marty what she has done, in a conversation in their kitchen that is one of the most uncomfortable scenes in the show's run. And Marty's response, the stunned silence of a man who believed he understood what his wife was capable of, is the moment Ozark reveals its deepest card. Wendy Byrde had crossed a line that Marty Byrde, for all his cartel entanglements and financial crimes and moral compromises, had not crossed. She had ordered the death of her brother. She had done it with full knowledge of what she was doing, and she had done it to protect the operation. This is the central difference between these two women and what it reveals about the two shows. Skylar White spends 5 seasons resisting her husband's transformation, being worn down by it, eventually becoming complicit in it out of fear and exhaustion and the narrowing of her options to a set she could not escape. Her arc is a tragedy of a particular kind, the tragedy of a decent person being slowly poisoned by proximity to someone who has made choices she cannot endorse and cannot escape. Wendy Byrde spends 4 seasons choosing, actively, repeatedly, with clear eyes and considerable intelligence, choosing to go further, to do more, to become more dangerous than anyone around her had anticipated. Her arc is not a tragedy of passivity. It is a tragedy of agency. She wanted this. She was good at it. And the cost of being good at it was her brother's life and her son's trust, and whatever version of herself had existed before the Ozarks took her apart and put her back together as something harder. The audience's response to these two women has been instructive in opposite ways. Skylar White was hated for resisting. Wendy Byrde was largely admired for participating. The contrast says something about what television audiences have decided they want from women in these kinds of stories. They did not want Skylar to say no. They did not want her moral clarity. They wanted her to get on board, to support her husband, to become part of the project. And when she refused, they punished her with a decade of online vitriol. Wendy Byrde got on board. She did not just support the project, she expanded it. She made it more efficient. She made decisions that Marty could not have made. And the audience rewarded her for it, with the specific admiration that prestige drama audiences tend to extend to characters who are competent at terrible things. She was cool. She was sharp. She was ruthless in interesting ways. The fact that the thing she was competent at was the systematic destruction of everyone around her, including eventually herself, was treated as a feature rather than a flaw. Both shows understood that the wife's story was the moral story. The husband's transformation or revelation could only be fully measured against the woman standing next to him, absorbing the consequences of what he was becoming. Skylar White is the conscience Breaking Bad kept trying to silence, the voice that kept asking whether this was really necessary, whether any of this was worth what it was costing. Wendy Byrde is the ambition Ozark unleashed, the woman who found, in the ruins of her suburban marriage, a version of herself she had not known was there, and who chose that version, even when choosing it meant destroying the people she was supposed to love most. Together, they are two of the most complete portraits of what it means to be married to a catastrophe. And the fact that one of them has been remembered primarily as an obstacle, and the other primarily as a partner, tells you almost everything you need to know about how far television audiences still have to go in understanding what these two shows were actually saying about the women inside them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The wives absorbed what their husbands built and were changed by the absorbing, in ways neither show lets you look away from. But the damage did not stay inside the marriages, and the children growing up inside those houses were watching everything. Section 3. The money. What it means, what it does, and what it eventually becomes. There is a scene in the 2nd season of Breaking Bad that the show uses almost as a joke at first, and that becomes, the longer you sit with it, one of the most precise statements either of these two shows ever made about what money actually is when it comes from the wrong place. Walter White has been cooking methamphetamine for several months. He has accumulated more cash than he has any legitimate way to explain or store. And so he takes the money, bundled in rubber bands, and he hides it in the crawlspace beneath his house. He goes down there alone with a flashlight, and he stacks the bills in the dirt in the dark underneath the place where his family sleeps. He does not put it in a bank. He does not invest it. He does not even count it carefully. He just puts it in the ground underneath the house, the way people in a different era buried things they were not supposed to have. And the image of that money sitting in the dirt, wrapped in rubber bands, slowly accumulating in the dark while the family above it eats dinner and does homework and watches television, is the show telling you, as plainly as it knows how, what this money actually is. It is not wealth. It is not security. It is not the provision Walter told himself he was making for his family. It is a secret buried under the place where people he loves are trying to live normal lives. And secrets buried under houses have a way of eventually coming up through the floor. Money is the engine of both Breaking Bad and Ozark in the most literal possible sense. Without money, there is no plot. Without the need for it in one show and the management of it in the other, neither Walter White nor Marty Byrde has any reason to do any of the things either of them does across 9 combined seasons. But money in both shows is never just money. It is never simply a neutral medium of exchange that happens to be the object of criminal activity. In both shows, money is a language. It is a way of speaking about power and fear and identity, and the specific American belief that financial success is the truest available measure of a person's worth. Both shows use money to say things about their characters that the characters themselves cannot say out loud. And the things money says in both shows are almost never comfortable. Walter White's relationship with money is the relationship of a man who has spent his entire adult life believing that he deserved more than he got, and who has finally found a way to get it. This is the part of his motivation that the show takes its time revealing. Because in the early seasons, Walter's stated reason for cooking meth is always the cancer, and the family, and the financial provision. These reasons are real. They are not invented. He does have cancer. He does have a family that will struggle financially when he dies. The financial justification is not a lie, exactly. It is an incomplete truth, which is the more dangerous version of a lie, because it is so much easier to maintain. The complete truth, which the show assembles gradually across 5 seasons, and which Walter himself only approaches in the very last episode when he finally admits it to Skyler, is that he did it for himself. He did it because he liked it, because it made him feel alive in a way that standing in front of teenagers teaching chemistry at a level far below his capability had never made him feel. Because it gave him power. Because it turned out that he was extraordinarily good at it. And being extraordinarily good at something, after decades of being moderately adequate at everything, was a feeling he was not willing to give up once he had found it. The money in this reading is not the point. It is the evidence. Every dollar Walter makes is proof that he was right about himself all along. He was not a mediocre chemistry teacher in a too small house with a too tight budget. He was a man of exceptional capability who had simply been operating in the wrong arena. The meth is his arena. The money is his scorecard. And the accumulation of it, which becomes increasingly disconnected from any practical need as the series goes on, is Walter's way of keeping score in a game whose rules he invented and whose only real opponent is the version of himself he used to be. This is why the moment in the 5th season episode Gliding Over All, when Skyler takes Walter down to a storage unit and shows him what the money has become, is one of the most important moments in the entire series. She has been laundering it through the car wash. She has been doing the work. And it has accumulated beyond any amount they could ever use. The pile of cash in that storage unit, which the production team has said required actual currency to film because the prop money did not stack convincingly enough, is taller than Skylar. It fills the unit almost to the ceiling. She tells Walter that she stopped counting because the laundering machines literally could not process it fast enough to keep up with the incoming volume. There is more money in that unit than the White family could spend in several lifetimes of ordinary living. And Walter looks at it, and instead of the satisfaction he has been chasing across 4 seasons, his face shows something else. Something closer to confusion. The score has gotten so large that it no longer means anything. The proof of his exceptionalism has become a logistical problem he cannot solve. The money, which was supposed to be the answer to everything, has become its own kind of trap. Marty Byrde's relationship with money is different in almost every way. And the difference begins with the fact that for Marty, money has never been a proof of anything. It has always been a system, a mechanism, a series of flows and channels and instruments that can be shaped and directed toward outcomes if you understand the rules that govern them. Marty does not love money the way Walter loves money. He does not need it to tell him who he is. He needs it to function, the way a surgeon needs a scalpel or a musician needs an instrument. It is his tool, his medium, the thing through which his particular form of intelligence expresses itself. When he is laundering money for the cartel, he is not doing it out of ego or greed or the desperate need to prove his own worth. He is doing it because he is extraordinarily good at it, and because the alternative is death, and because, somewhere in the years before the show begins, he made a series of small accommodations to the criminal world that eventually became so large and so structural that he could no longer locate the door he had walked through to get inside. The money laundering operation Marty builds in the Ozarks is, from a purely technical standpoint, one of the most elaborate and interesting elements of either show. The show takes the mechanics of money laundering seriously in a way that financial crimes dramas rarely do. Marty does not just open a front business and run cash through it. He builds a layered system. He acquires a strip club. He acquires a funeral home. He acquires a riverboat casino, which becomes the central vehicle for the operation and around which most of the show's middle seasons are built. He uses the casino specifically because a cash-heavy entertainment business provides the ideal environment for introducing criminal money into the legitimate financial system. Because the volume of transactions is high, because the cash nature of the business is expected and unremarkable, and because the regulatory environment, while not lax, is manageable for someone with Marty's financial intelligence and attention to detail. The show, in its best moments, is genuinely educational about the mechanics of how criminal money moves through legitimate systems. And Marty, as he explains these mechanics to various reluctant participants across the series, is more animated and more visibly engaged than in almost any other context. The money laundering is his art form. Watching him do it is the equivalent of watching a craftsman work. But Ozark is also honest, in a way that financial crime dramas sometimes are not, about what this kind of system does to everyone it touches. Because the money that Marty is laundering is not abstract. It comes from somewhere. It comes from the Navarro cartel's drug operation, which exists at the end of a supply chain that includes addiction and violence, and death on a scale that the show only occasionally makes visible, but never lets you fully forget. Marty's financial genius, the tool he is so proud of, is in service of an enterprise that destroys lives at its source. And the people in the Ozarks who get pulled into his operation, the local business owners, the politicians, the pastor, the members of the Langmore family. All of them end up touched by money that carries that invisible freight. The money does not arrive with a label explaining where it came from. It arrives looking like opportunity. And opportunity, in a rural Missouri lake town where economic opportunity has been scarce for decades, is very difficult to refuse. This is one of the places where Ozark makes its most pointed social observation. The Ozark setting is not incidental. It is chosen. The show is set in a community that has been economically left behind by the same forces that have left behind rural communities across the American Midwest, where the manufacturing jobs went away, and the agricultural economy contracted, and the tax base eroded, and the public services deteriorated, and the people who could leave did, and the people who could not stay and try to make something work with what remains. Into this community, Marty Byrde arrives with essentially unlimited capital, willing to invest in local businesses and local institutions, willing to build things and employ people, and create economic activity in a place that has been starved of it. And the community responds the way communities respond to capital when they have been without it long enough. They take it. They do not ask too many questions about where it comes from. They rationalize. They accommodate. They become, gradually and without any single dramatic moment of choice, participants in the same system that is destroying lives at its far end. Walter White's money does something similar to the people around him, but the mechanism is different. Walter does not invest in communities. He does not create local employment or fund charitable organizations or cultivate political relationships. He spends his money on himself and on his operation, and on the occasional gift to his family that he cannot explain without lying. The money changes him rather than the people around him, at least at first. It gives him access to a version of himself he has been suppressing for decades. The pride, the contempt for people he considers his intellectual inferiors. The willingness to make decisions about other people's lives and deaths based purely on what is operationally convenient for him. The money does not create these qualities in Walter. They were there. The money just removes the constraints that were keeping them in check. He could not afford to be this person when he was a high school chemistry teacher with a second job at a car wash. Now he can. And the permission that financial power gives him to become his worst self is the central engine of what Breaking Bad is about. By the end of both shows, the money has done what it always does in this kind of story. It has revealed. It has revealed that Walter White was not cooking meth to provide for his family. He was doing it because it made him feel like the person he always believed he should have been. It has revealed that Marty Byrde's financial genius, the quality he took most pride in, was also the quality that made him most useful to people who wanted to use him. It has revealed that neither of these men was ever really in control of the money, no matter how sophisticated their operations or how carefully they managed the flows and the channels and the instruments. The money was always in control of them. It was always the thing organizing their lives, determining their relationships, shaping their decisions, narrowing their options, until the options had narrowed to a point where neither of them could see a way out that did not cost them everything. There is a moment in the final season of Ozark when the Byrde family foundation has become a significant political force in Missouri, and Wendy is meeting with senators, and Marty is managing relationships with the cartel and the FBI simultaneously, where the money has become so fully integrated into every structure around them that it is no longer possible to identify where the criminal money ends and the legitimate money begins. The two systems have merged. The laundering has been so thorough and so sustained that the output is indistinguishable from genuine wealth. The Byrde family has, in the most literal sense, cleaned the money. And in doing so, they have also cleaned themselves, at least on the surface. They look legitimate, They look successful. They look like exactly the kind of upper-middle-class professional family they were pretending to be when the show began. The cartel money has purchased them a real version of the life they were only performing before. This is the final thing money does in both shows. It purchases the appearance of legitimacy. It takes the thing that cannot be said out loud and buries it under enough transactions and enough time and enough successful outcomes that the people performing the burial can almost convince themselves, in the right light, that nothing is buried at all. Walter White in his crawl space, stacking bills in the dirt. Marty Byrde at his foundation gala, shaking hands with politicians. Both of them surrounded by money that was supposed to solve a problem, and that solved the problem by becoming a larger and more permanent version of the same problem. Both of them looking to the outside world like men who had figured something out. Both of them knowing, in the part of themselves they could not afford to examine too closely, that the figure underneath the money was still there, still counting, still waiting for the floor to give way. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The money built the world, and the world had a logic that pulled everyone inside it further than they planned to go. But the people pulled furthest were the ones who never fully chose to enter, and their story is the one that cuts deepest. Section 4. The Children. Flynn, Holly, Jonah, and Charlotte, and the damage done in silence. There is a moment in the third season of Breaking Bad that the show places almost quietly, without calling attention to it, without surrounding it with dramatic music or extended reaction shots, that contains more information about what Walter White has done to his son than almost any other scene in the series. Walt Jr., who goes by Flynn, and who has cerebral palsy, and who has spent the entire show believing, with the specific, fierce loyalty of a teenage boy who idolizes his father, that Walter White is a good man who got sick and fought back and survived, is sitting at the breakfast table. He is eating. He does this a lot across the series, eating breakfast, because the show uses the breakfast table as its primary domestic image, the place where the family performs normalcy most visibly, and where the cracks in that performance are most visible if you know where to look. And in this particular scene, Flynn has found out that his parents are separating, that his father has moved out, that the marriage he grew up inside is coming apart. He does not know why. He does not have access to the real information. He has only what both parents have chosen to give him, which is a carefully managed, partial version of events designed to protect him from the truth. And he sits at the table, eating his breakfast. And the look on his face is the look of a teenager who knows that the story he is being told does not add up, and who does not have the tools or the information to figure out what the real story is. He is eating breakfast in the ruins of something he does not yet understand is ruined. And the show holds on that image just long enough for the weight of it to register before moving on. That image, a child eating breakfast in a house where the foundations have already failed, is the image both Breaking Bad and Ozark return to across their combined run whenever they want to remind you what is actually at stake in these stories. The children. Not the chemistry, not the money, not the cartel or the DEA or the various antagonists who arrive to complicate the plot in interesting ways. The children, sitting at tables and doing homework and going to school and trying to build an understanding of the world in houses where the adults have decided, for reasons the children are not permitted to know, to burn everything down. Walt Jr. and Holly White and Jonah and Charlotte Byrde are four of the most important characters in either show, not because they drive the plot, but because they are the measure of it. Everything that Walter and Marty and Skylar and Wendy do is supposed to be for the children, in the justification both couples reach for when the justification is needed. And the children, across 9 seasons of combined television, are the living proof of how completely that justification fails. Walt Jr. is, in many ways, the most straightforward of the 4. He is a teenager with a physical disability who has built his sense of self substantially around his relationship with his father. This is not unusual for teenage boys, especially teenage boys who have grown up watching a parent navigate something as difficult as cerebral palsy alongside the ordinary challenges of adolescence. Walter has been, from Flynn's perspective, a man who persevered, who showed up, who came to the school events and coached the attitude, and modeled a kind of stubborn, dignified persistence in the face of difficulty that Flynn has internalized as a template for how a man is supposed to behave. Walter White, the chemistry teacher with the too small house and the second job at the car wash, was, in his son's eyes, a hero of the ordinary. A man who kept going, a man who did not complain, a man who got cancer and decided to fight rather than surrender. Flynn has built his understanding of masculinity and perseverance and what it means to be a good person almost entirely on this foundation. And the foundation, as the series makes clear with patient and devastating thoroughness, was not what Flynn believed it was. The show is careful, for most of its run, to keep Flynn genuinely uninformed about what his father is doing. This is a deliberate choice. It would have been easy, and in some ways more dramatically interesting, to let Flynn figure it out earlier, to watch him process the information and make choices about what to do with it. But Vince Gilligan and the writing staff made the harder choice, which was to keep Flynn in the dark almost until the very end. Because the darkness is the point. Flynn's ignorance is not a plot convenience. It is a moral condition. It is the condition Walter has imposed on his son by deciding that the management of Flynn's perception of him is more important than Flynn's right to understand the truth of his own life. Walter controls what Flynn knows because Walter needs Flynn to keep believing in the version of Walter White that Flynn grew up with, the hero of the ordinary, the good man who got sick and fought back. Flynn's belief in that version of his father is the last piece of Walter's self-image that has not been corrupted by what he has become, and he protects it with the same ferocity he brings to protecting his operation. When Flynn finally learns the truth in the 5th season episode Ozymandias, he learns it all at once, in the worst possible way. He comes home to find his parents in a physical confrontation in the kitchen. Skylar has a knife. Walter is trying to take it from her. The scene, which has been building across the entire series toward exactly this kind of rupture, is brutal and domestic and terrifying in equal measure. And Flynn, who comes through the door at the wrong moment and sees his father wrestling a knife away from his mother, does the thing that Flynn has always done. He steps in. He tries to protect his mother. He calls the police on his own father. And in the phone call to 911, his voice breaking, using his full given name, Walter Hartwell White, because in the extremity of the moment, the childhood nickname falls away, and what is left is the formal distance of a son who has just understood that the man he built himself around was not real. Flynn announces the end of his relationship with his father as completely as it is possible to announce it. He does not say goodbye. He does not have a final conversation. He just stands between his parents in the kitchen and chooses his mother, which is the only choice available to him now that the truth has finally arrived. Walter leaves. Flynn never sees him again, except at the end, briefly, when Walter comes back to say something that is less an apology than a confession. And Flynn tells him to go away. That is the last thing Flynn ever says to his father. Go away. Walter goes. Flynn is left with the breakfast table and the house, and the ruins of the foundation he built himself on, at 17 years old, with no map for how to build something new on ground that has been this thoroughly contaminated. Holly White is a different kind of case, and in some ways the more disturbing one, because Holly is an infant for the entire run of the show, and therefore has no ability to understand, process, resist, or respond to any of what is happening around her. She is born in the second season. She is a few months old by the time the series ends. She is too young to have formed memories, too young to have built the kind of conscious attachment to her father that Flynn built over years of breakfast tables and school events. And yet the show uses her, in the back half of the 5th season, in ways that make her the most emotionally loaded character in the final episodes. Walter, in a moment of desperation and rage after the confrontation in the kitchen, takes Holly. He puts her in the car and drives away with her. He does not have a plan. He is not thinking clearly. He is acting from the same impulse that has driven every terrible decision he has made across 5 seasons. The impulse to control, to take, to refuse to accept the consequences of his own choices. He takes Holly the way he has taken everything, because he wants her. Because in the moment of losing everything else, she is the one thing he can still hold. He cannot keep her, and he knows it within hours. He stops at a fire station and leaves her in a safe drop location, wrapped in a blanket with her name written on her diaper so the people who find her can identify her. The image of Holly in that safe drop location, alone, wrapped in a blanket, waiting for someone to find her, is one of the most quietly devastating images in the series. She has not done anything. She has not made any choices. She has simply been born into this family, at this moment, and to this story. And the story has made her into an object of her father's desperation, rather than a person he was capable of protecting. She is returned to Skylar. She grows up, presumably, without any conscious memory of her father. She will know him only through whatever Skylar eventually tells her, through whatever public record exists, through the story of what happened in Albuquerque that became, in the fictional world of the show, a piece of actual cultural history. Holly White will grow up with a famous father she never knew. That is what Walter's love for her produced. A famous name attached to a man she has no memory of and no relationship with. The provision he told himself he was making for his family, reduced to its most honest form, is that his infant daughter will spend her life explaining who her father was to people who already think they know. Jonah Byrde is the character in Ozark who most directly inherits the moral weight of his parents' choices. And the show traces his inheritance with a patience and a specificity that makes him, by the final season, one of the most interesting characters in either series. He is around 12 years old when the show begins, bookish and observant, and clearly the Byrde child who is paying the most attention to the gap between what his parents say and what his parents do. Charlotte, his older sister, is more focused on the social disruption of the move to the Ozarks, on her lost friendships and her ruined junior year, on the ordinary grievances of an adolescent whose life has been upended without her consent. Jonah is looking at something else. He is looking at his father's work. He is asking questions nobody wants to answer. He is, from the very beginning of the show, the family member most likely to eventually understand what is actually happening. And the show tracks his progress toward that understanding with the kind of slow, careful attention it gives to the financial mechanics, treating his growing knowledge as its own form of dangerous accumulation. Jonah figures it out earlier than any of the other children in either show figure out anything. By the end of the first season, he knows enough to understand that his family is laundering money. By the second season, he is actively participating, helping Marty with financial tasks, learning the system from the inside. By the third season, He has become a genuinely skilled financial operator in his own right, setting up shell companies and managing accounts with a fluency that disturbs even Marty, who recognizes his own gift in his son's aptitude and cannot decide whether he is proud or horrified. And when the third season reveals that Wendy ordered Ben's death, Jonah's response is to take a shotgun and shoot out the windows of his own house. It is the most viscerally emotional thing he does in the entire series. A teenage boy with a gun and a grief he has no language for, destroying the shell of the domestic life his parents had been performing around him. He is not destroying the house because he is angry at the house. He is destroying the performance. The windows, the surfaces, the thing that from the outside looked like a family, and from the inside was something he no longer has a word for. Charlotte Byrde's arc is quieter and in some ways more honest about what it actually feels like to be a child in this kind of family. She spends the first season trying to leave, filing the legal paperwork to become an emancipated minor, going so far as to hire a lawyer and appear before a judge, before ultimately deciding to stay. She stays not because she has been convinced that her parents' choices are right or that the situation is acceptable. She stays because she has understood, in the specific way that children of complicated families sometimes understand things before they are ready to, that leaving does not actually get you out. The family is not a place she can walk away from. It is a condition she was born into, and the condition travels with her, regardless of where she physically locates herself. She stays because staying is at least honest about what she is. The emancipation attempt is not a failure. It is a piece of information. It tells her something about the limits of escape that she will spend the rest of the show processing. By the final season of Ozark, both Byrde children have been so thoroughly drawn into their parents' world that the question of whether they will escape it has been answered. Jonah is actively laundering money, running his own operation, using the skills his parents taught him to serve the same cartel that has organized their family's life for 4 years. Charlotte is managing the public face of the Byrde Foundation, helping Wendy with the political relationships, performing the legitimate surface of the operation with the same fluency her mother brought to it. They are not victims by the final season. They are participants. The inheritance has been fully transferred. And the transfer happened not through any single dramatic moment of corruption, but through years of daily proximity to a world that gradually replaced their understanding of how things were supposed to work, with an understanding of how things actually worked in the Byrde household. They did not choose this. They were built into it. The same way Marty was built into his choices years before the show began. Through a process of accumulation so gradual that no individual step felt like the decisive one. This is what both shows understand about children that they state plainly, without sentimentality, through the accumulated weight of these 4 characters across 9 seasons. Children do not need to be told the truth about their parents to be shaped by it. The truth reaches them anyway, through the texture of daily life, through the things that are not said, through the presence of strangers who appear and disappear, through the money that pays for things without explanation, through the fear they can feel in the adults around them, even when the adults are performing calm. Flynn built a father out of what Walter let him see, and collapsed when the reality arrived. Holly will build a father out of whatever history gives her, and will never have the chance to collapse, because there is no relationship to collapse. Jonah absorbed his parents' world so completely that by the end he was doing their work. Charlotte understood the trap and chose to stay inside it because she had learned from watching her parents that the trap was also the only available home. 4 children. 4 different forms of the same damage. All of it done in the name of love and provision and family, which are the words both Walter White and Marty Byrde reach for when they need to explain why any of this was necessary. The children are the answer to that explanation. The children are what necessary actually produced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The children inherited what they were never asked to carry, and carried it anyway in the only ways available to them. Closest to the center of both stories, though, were the partners. And what was done to them is the clearest moral statement either show ever made. Section 5. The Partners. Jesse Pinkman and Ruth Langmore, and the people they used and failed. There is a scene in the 3rd season of Breaking Bad that the show places in the middle of an episode without announcement or dramatic scaffolding. A scene so quiet and so precise that it is easy to miss what it is actually doing on a first watch, and almost impossible to forget on a second. Jesse Pinkman is sitting alone in his apartment. He has been sitting there for what the visual evidence suggests has been a very long time. The apartment is not dirty exactly, but it has the specific quality of a space that has stopped being lived in and started being occupied. The distinction between those two things being the presence or absence of any forward motion. Any sense that the person inside it is moving towards something rather than simply remaining. Jesse is not moving toward anything. He is sitting. He is staring. He is carrying, in his body and his face and the particular quality of his stillness, the weight of something the show has not yet named out loud, but that the audience, by this point in the series, already understands. He has killed someone. Not in self-defense, not accidentally. He killed Gail Bedecker, a gentle, decent, genuinely innocent man, because Walter White put him in a position where killing Gail was the only way to keep Walter alive. Jesse pulled the trigger. Jesse has to live with what the trigger produced. And the apartment and the stillness and the face are what living with it looks like. That image, a young man sitting alone in the aftermath of something he cannot undo, carrying a weight he did not choose and was not equipped for, is the image that defines Jesse Pinkman's entire arc across 5 seasons of Breaking Bad. And it is also, in a different register and a different landscape, but with the same essential quality of a person being asked to carry more than they were built for, by someone who does not fully account for the cost. The image that defines Ruth Langmore across 4 seasons of Ozark. Jesse and Ruth are not the same character. They come from different worlds, operate in different emotional registers, make different choices, and end up in very different places when their respective stories conclude. But they are performing the same structural function inside their shows. They are the partners, the people brought in closest, the ones whose particular combination of capability and vulnerability made them maximally useful to the men at the center. And they are, in both shows, the characters whose treatment at the hands of those men constitutes the clearest moral verdict on who Walter White and Marty Byrde actually are, underneath the justifications they have assembled around themselves. Jesse Pinkman is introduced in the Breaking Bad pilot as a small-time methamphetamine dealer and former student of Walter White's, who is, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of person Walter considers himself not to be. He is young, careless, loud, drug-addicted, living in a house he inherited from his aunt, and that he is allowed to deteriorate around him while he parties with a rotating cast of friends who treat the space as a permanent recreational facility. He speaks in a vernacular that Walter finds embarrassing. He makes decisions that Walter finds baffling. He has dropped out of Walter's chemistry class years earlier, having failed to demonstrate any particular aptitude for the subject. And Walter's initial attitude toward him is the attitude of a man who has reluctantly hired a contractor he considers incompetent, because the contractor happens to have access to a distribution network he needs. He is not a partner in any meaningful sense at the beginning of their arrangement. He is a tool, a means of access to a market Walter could not reach on his own. Walter makes this clear repeatedly in the early seasons, in the condescension of his tone, in the way he dismisses Jesse's suggestions, in the way he talks about him to Skylar, in the rare moments he mentions him at all. Jesse is beneath him. Jesse is a resource. Jesse is someone Walter is using because Walter needs him. And the need is a source of private irritation rather than genuine connection. And yet, something happens across the first 2 seasons that neither Walter nor the show fully anticipated when it began. Jesse turns out to be a person, not just a resource, not just a distribution network in a yellow hazmat suit. A person with a specific history, a specific wound, a specific set of capacities for loyalty and feeling and genuine human connection that Walter, who has been treating him as a means to an end, has not accounted for and does not know what to do with once he becomes aware of it. Jesse loved a woman named Jane Margolis, who was also a recovering addict, and who, in the 2nd season, relapsed into heroin use in ways that threatened the operation. Jane died of an overdose, while Walter stood and watched, having made the calculation that her death was operationally preferable to her continued involvement in Jesse's life, and, by extension, his own. Walter watched her die and did not intervene. Jesse does not know this. Jesse believed for years that Jane died because of her own addiction and his failure to protect her. The guilt of that belief shaped him for the remainder of the series. And Walter, who knew the truth, who had the information that would have told Jesse that his guilt was misplaced, kept the information because releasing it would have cost Walter something he was not willing to pay. This is the central dynamic of Walter and Jesse's relationship rendered in its most concentrated form. Walter has something Jesse needs: information, protection, money, purpose, a sense of being part of something that justifies the terrible things they have both done. And Walter dispenses it in exactly the quantities required to keep Jesse functional and attached and useful, withholding whatever would make Jesse truly free. He does this not through conscious villainy, at least not initially. He does it through the same automatic self-interest that governs every relationship in his life. He keeps Jesse close because Jesse is valuable. He keeps Jesse dependent because dependent people do not leave. He manages Jesse's emotional state the way he manages the chemistry of his product, with precision and control, and a fundamental indifference to what the process costs the materials being worked with. Jesse is not a person to Walter in the way that Walter is a person to Walter. He is a variable in an equation whose outcome Walter has already decided. The show makes this explicit in the 5th season, when Walter, in the episode Confessions, manipulates Jesse into leaving Albuquerque by engineering a situation in which Jesse believes that leaving is his own idea. The manipulation is so thorough and so precise that it takes Jesse several episodes to realize he has been managed rather than persuaded. And the moment of realization, when Jesse finally understands the full scope of what Walter has been doing to him since the beginning of the show, is one of the most important moments in either series. Jesse has a gasoline can in his hand. He is going to burn Walter's house down. He is shaking with a rage that has nowhere adequate to go. Because the thing Walter has done to him is not the kind of thing that has a proportionate response. He has not just lied to Jesse. He has organized Jesse's entire life around a lie. He has used Jesse's guilt and Jesse's loyalty, and Jesse's genuine love for him as instruments of control for 5 years. He has let Jane die. He has poisoned a child named Brock to manipulate Jesse's behavior. He has, in the most complete sense available, treated a human being as a resource and discarded him the moment the resource became more expensive than it was worth. Jesse does not burn the house down. He is stopped before he can. But he does eventually find his way to the DEA and to Hank Schrader, and the alliance he forms with the people hunting Walter is the final statement of what Walter's treatment of him has produced. Jesse did not go to the DEA because he wanted Walter in prison. He went because he ran out of other ways to make it stop. Walter had taken everything from him. Jane, Brock's innocence, Andrea, a woman Jesse loved who was killed in front of him by Todd Alquist as a warning to Jesse while he was being held captive. His freedom, his sense of himself as a person capable of making meaningful choices. What Walter had left him with was a rage he could not discharge, and a grief he could not process, and a guilt that had been deliberately cultivated in him to keep him manageable. The DEA was not justice. It was the only door left open. Jesse walked through it, not because he believed in it, but because every other door had been closed by Walter White. Ruth Langmore is introduced in the Ozark pilot as a young woman in her early 20s who is part of an extended family of small-time criminals in the Lake region, a family defined by poverty and by a specific culture of low-level law-breaking that has been the family's primary economic strategy for at least 2 generations. She is sharp, fiercely, almost dangerously sharp, in the specific way that very intelligent people who have grown up without access to institutions that would have recognized and developed their intelligence are sharp. Through necessity and observation and the honing of instinct against a world that has not offered them many other tools. She is also, when we first meet her, limited. Not in capacity, but in horizon. She can see what is in front of her. She cannot yet see past it, cannot imagine a version of her life that is different in kind rather than just in degree from the life she has been living. She wants more. She does not yet know what more looks like. Marty Byrde gives her a glimpse of what more looks like. And the glimpse is the thing that makes Ruth's story in Ozark both its most compelling element and its most honest moral argument. Because what Marty offers Ruth is not just money or employment or even the specific excitement of being involved in something larger and more dangerous than anything she has previously had access to. What he offers her is the experience of being recognized, of having someone look at her and see what she actually is, which is a person of exceptional financial and organizational intelligence who has been operating in an environment far too small for what she is capable of. Marty sees Ruth clearly, in a way that almost nobody in her life has seen her before. And Ruth, who has been waiting her whole life to be seen, responds to that recognition with a loyalty and a commitment that she extends beyond any reasonable limit, beyond the point where the loyalty is being reciprocated, beyond the point where the commitment is serving her interest, all the way to the point where it is actively destroying her. The show traces Ruth's relationship with Marty across 4 seasons, with the same slow patience it brings to the financial mechanics, understanding that the emotional dynamics are as structurally important as the laundering operations. Ruth works for Marty. She becomes indispensable to him. She learns from him. She develops, under his mentorship, into a genuinely sophisticated financial operator who understands not just the mechanics of what they are doing, but the strategic logic of it, the way the pieces fit together, the vulnerabilities in the system, and the ways to address them. She is, by the middle of the series, better at some aspects of the operation than Marty himself. And Marty knows this. He relies on her. He trusts her in the specific, limited way that he trusts anyone, which is to say that he trusts her as long as her interests and his interests are aligned. And he manages her carefully in the moments when they are not. The moment of rupture between Ruth and Marty comes in the 3rd season, when Ben Davis is killed. Ruth loved Ben. The relationship between them was one of the few genuinely warm, genuinely mutual emotional connections either of them had experienced in their respective lives. Ben was chaotic and difficult, and ultimately impossible to protect, but he was also funny and present, and capable of the kind of uncomplicated affection that Ruth, who had grown up in a family of men who expressed love primarily through violence and absence, had rarely received. His death, and the revelation that Wendy had told the cartel's fixer where to find him, broke something in Ruth that the show understands cannot be repaired. She leaves the Byrde operation. She goes to work for Darlene Snell, the local heroin producer whose operation she eventually takes over and expands. And the path she takes from that point forward is the path of a woman who has decided, after years of being managed and used and ultimately failed by the people she was most loyal to build something of her own that nobody else controls. The parallel between Jesse and Ruth across their respective shows is the parallel of two people who brought genuine capability and genuine feeling to relationships with men who were ultimately incapable of valuing either. Walter White used Jesse's chemistry access and distribution network and emotional loyalty, and then discarded him when the cost of keeping him exceeded the value of his utility. Marty Byrde used Ruth's intelligence and organizational capability and fierce commitment, and then failed to protect the things she needed protecting when the protection required him to prioritize someone other than himself. Both men would say, if asked, that they cared about their partners. Walter has moments of what appears to be genuine feeling for Jesse. Marty has moments of what appears to be genuine respect and affection for Ruth. The moments are real. They are also insufficient. Because caring about someone in the moments when caring is convenient and failing them in the moments when caring would cost something is not actually caring. It is a performance of caring that serves the performer's need to believe themselves capable of it. Ruth Langmore ends Ozark dead, shot by Camila Navarro in retaliation for Ruth having killed Javi Navarro, the cartel member who ordered the hit that killed Wyatt Langmore, the cousin Ruth loved most. Her death is, in the context of the show's final season, almost inevitable. She has been moving toward it since the moment she left the Byrde operation, and chose, with full knowledge of the risk, to pursue the kind of direct justice that the Byrde family's approach, with its layers of financial instruments and political relationships and strategic maneuvering, was specifically designed to avoid. Ruth was not built for maneuvering. She was built for directness. And in a world organized around the kind of indirect, insulated, financially mediated violence that the Byrdes specialized in, directness gets you killed. She knew this. She chose it anyway. Because the alternative, the Byrde alternative, the world of endless accommodation and strategic patience and the subordination of every feeling to the requirements of the operation, was not a world Ruth Langmore was willing to live inside any longer. Jesse Pinkman ends Breaking Bad alive, driving a car through a fence at the neo-Nazi compound where he has been held captive, screaming with a release that is equal parts terror and joy and grief, and the specific kind of relief that arrives when a person who has been in a cage for a very long time finally feels the cage give way. His ending is deliberately left open. The movie El Camino, released in 2019, follows his story after the escape and gives him a conclusion of sorts, a new identity, and a chance at something that is not quite a fresh start, but is at least a continuation. He survives. He gets out. He is damaged in ways that will not fully heal, and carrying memories that will not leave him alone. But he is alive. He is free. He is, at the end of his story, the person the show most clearly wants to survive, because he is the person who suffered the most without choosing the suffering, who was used the most completely, who paid the highest price for a project that was never really his. His survival is the show's closest gesture toward mercy. Not justice, not redemption, just the small, hard mercy of a person who has been used up being allowed to continue. The difference in their endings, Ruth dead in a parking lot and Jesse driving through a fence, is not a judgment on their relative worth. It is a statement about the worlds they inhabited. Breaking Bad, for all its darkness, believed that the person most completely victimized by Walter White deserved to survive him. Ozark believed that the world it had built was too thoroughly organized around the interests of people like the Byrdes for someone like Ruth to find a way through it. Both endings are honest. Both are earned. And both say something true about what it costs to be the person who brings the most genuine humanity to a relationship with someone who cannot adequately return it. You pay. You pay with your freedom, or your life, or both. The payment is not fair. It was never going to be fair. Jesse and Ruth both knew this, somewhere underneath the loyalty and the capability and the genuine feeling they brought to partnerships that were designed, from the beginning, to extract from them rather than to give. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jesse and Ruth brought the most genuine humanity to relationships that were designed to extract from them, and both paid the full price for that generosity. The people who defined the outer limits of those relationships arrive next, and what real power looks like in both shows is the next piece of this. Section 6. The Antagonists. Gus Fring, Tuco, the cartel, and the Navarro family, and what real power looks like. There is a scene in the third season of Breaking Bad that the show uses to introduce, in its fullest and most deliberate form, the idea that Walter White is not the most dangerous man in his own story. Walter has been summoned to a meeting, not requested, not invited, summoned, in the specific way that people who have no choice about whether they attend a meeting are summoned, through a chain of intermediaries and implied consequences that make the voluntary nature of the invitation entirely theoretical. He is taken to a remote location. He waits. And then Gustavo Fring arrives. Gus Fring, who Walter has known for 2 seasons as the mild-mannered owner of a regional fast food chicken chain, who has always been pleasant and unremarkable and slightly bland in the way that people who are hiding something enormous sometimes perform blandness as their primary defense. Gus sits down across from Walter. He does not raise his voice. He does not make threats in any language that a recording device could use against him. He speaks quietly, with the specific measured cadence of a man who has had this kind of conversation many times before, and who understands that the most effective communication of power is not volume, but precision. He tells Walter, in so many words, that Walter will cook for him, that Walter's skills are required and his cooperation is expected, that the alternative to cooperation is a thing Gus does not need to describe in detail, because Walter is intelligent enough to understand what it is without being told. And Walter, who has spent 2 seasons telling himself and everyone around him that he is the one who knocks, sits across from Gustavo Fring and says nothing, because there is nothing to say. He has just encountered something he did not know existed. A form of power so complete and so controlled and so far beyond anything Walter has assembled, that his own carefully cultivated menace feels, in comparison, like a child's drawing of a dangerous thing. That scene is the beginning of the most interesting structural argument either Breaking Bad or Ozark makes about the nature of power, and what it actually looks like when it has been fully developed by someone who understands it at a level most people never reach. Both shows are, among other things, extended meditations on power, on who has it and who does not, on how it is built and maintained and lost, on the difference between the kind of power that announces itself loudly and the kind that operates in silence and reveals itself only when it is already too late to respond to it. And the antagonists in both shows, the people who exist in opposition to Walter and Marty, and who ultimately define the limits of what Walter and Marty can achieve, are the show's primary vehicles for exploring what real power, as opposed to performed power, actually consists of. Gustavo Fring is the most fully realized antagonist in either show, and possibly one of the most fully realized antagonists in the history of prestige television drama. He is, in the surface presentation he offers to the world, so completely ordinary as to be almost invisible. He manages a chain of fast food restaurants called Los Pollos Hermanos. He is involved in community charity work. He donates to the DEA. He is polite to his employees, remembered by his customers, respected by his business associates. He is, by every visible measure, a successful small business owner who has built something genuine through hard work and careful management. The surface is so thoroughly maintained, so consistently performed, that it functions not just as a cover, but as a genuine identity. Gus Fring is not pretending to be a respectable businessman while secretly being a drug kingpin. He has built two complete versions of himself, and he inhabits both of them with equal fluency. The drug operation is not more real than the chicken restaurant. They are both real. They are both him. And the ability to sustain two complete identities simultaneously, without either one contaminating the other, without any visible seam where the two versions of himself meet, is the thing that makes him so much more dangerous than anyone else in the show, including Walter. What Gus Fring has that Walter White does not have, and that Walter spends the entire time he knows Gus either trying to acquire or trying to destroy, is patience. Gus has been building his operation for decades. He has built the infrastructure. He has cultivated the relationships. He has embedded himself so thoroughly in the legitimate world that the legitimate world actively defends him, not because it knows what he is, but because he has made himself genuinely useful to it. He has contacts in law enforcement who consider him a community asset. He has politicians who have accepted his donations and attended his fundraisers. He has a supply chain that runs from the Chilean cartel through a network of distribution nodes disguised as legitimate businesses all the way to the street-level dealers who move the product. He built this over 20 years. He built it without rushing. He built it with the specific long-term vision of a man who understands that the most durable forms of power are the ones that take the longest to build, because they are the ones most thoroughly integrated into the systems that surround them. Walter, by contrast, builds quickly and loudly, and with an ego that keeps announcing itself in situations where silence would have been safer. He cooks the best meth anyone has ever seen, and he makes sure that people know it is his. He brands his product with a blue color that becomes a street-level identifier. He kills people who threaten him in ways that leave forensic evidence and draw attention. He makes enemies of people who could have been managed more quietly. He is brilliant at the chemistry and dangerously impatient with the politics. And the impatience is the thing that keeps getting people killed, and that eventually gets him killed. Gus understood, from the first time he assessed Walter White as a potential asset, that Walter's ego was going to be the primary management challenge of their working relationship. He tried to manage it. He was more successful at managing it than anyone else in the show, for longer than anyone else managed. But Walter's ego is not a manageable quantity. It is the engine of everything he does, and it cannot be redirected. It can only be contained until it explodes. And eventually, in the 4th season, it explodes in Gus's direction. And Gus dies. And Walter, standing in the parking lot of the hospital where Gus has just been killed by a bomb that Walter built and Walt's unlikely ally Hector Salamanca detonated, straightens his jacket and says, "I won." He says it to no one in particular. He says it to the air. He says it because winning, in Walter's accounting, is the point of everything. Gus never would have said that. Gus would not have needed to. Tuco Salamanca is the other major antagonist of the early seasons of Breaking Bad, and he represents the opposite end of the power spectrum from Gus. Where Gus is controlled and patient and invisible, Tuco is explosive and immediate and impossible to ignore. He is the distributor Walter first approaches when he needs to move his product. And the initial meeting between them ends with Walter blowing up Tuco's office with fulminated mercury, because Tuco has just beaten Jesse nearly to death over a business dispute. And Walter needs to establish, in the most unambiguous possible terms, that he is not someone Tuco can simply rob and dismiss. The scene is one of the most bravura moments in the early series. Walter walking into a hostile environment with nothing but a bag of crystals and a willingness to use them. And it works precisely because Tuco, like most people who organize their power around violence and volatility, is not equipped to respond to someone who is not afraid of the violence, because they have brought a bigger version of it. Tuco respects Walter briefly, in the way that people whose entire understanding of power is organized around physical force briefly respect anyone who demonstrates a credible capacity for physical force. And then Tuco does what volatile people always do. He becomes unpredictable in ways that threaten everyone around him, including his partners. And he has to be eliminated before he eliminates someone else. The Salamanca family, across Breaking Bad and its prequel series Better Call Saul, represent the oldest and most traditional form of cartel power, the form built on blood and territory, and a willingness to perform violence so extreme that the performance itself becomes a deterrent. Hector Salamanca, Tuco's uncle, is a man so committed to a specific vision of cartel honor and family loyalty that he sits in a wheelchair for years, unable to speak, communicating only through a bell attached to his chair, and still manages to be one of the most frightening presences in the entire story. His hatred of Gus Fring, rooted in a history the show takes its time revealing, is what Walter eventually weaponizes to destroy Gus. And the image of Hector in his wheelchair with the bomb hidden in the chair's frame, ringing his bell with the specific finality of a man who has been waiting years for exactly this moment, is the show's acknowledgement that the oldest forms of power, the ones built on blood grudges and family loyalty, and the kind of hatred that survives paralysis and years of institutional care, are not as obsolete as the more sophisticated operators would like to believe. The Navarro cartel in Ozark operates at a different scale and with a different texture than the Salamanca family or Gus Fring's operation. And the difference is instructive about what kind of story Ozark wants to tell about power. The cartel in Ozark is not primarily a source of violence, although it is certainly capable of violence and demonstrates that capability at regular intervals across 4 seasons. It is primarily a source of financial pressure. It is the entity that requires Marty to keep laundering money at a specific volume on a specific timeline under specific conditions. And the threat it represents is less the immediate physical threat of being shot in a parking garage, and more the structural threat of being embedded in a system so large and so thoroughly organized that there is no exit point that does not require the permission of the system itself. Omar Navarro, the cartel boss who is the primary face of that pressure across the middle seasons of the show, is not a monster in the Tuco Salamanca sense. He is a businessman. He has a family. He has concerns about his legacy. He wants, in some genuine way, to find a path out of the cartel life for himself and his children. And he believes that Marty Byrde's financial intelligence might be the instrument that makes that path available. He is using Marty the way Gus used Walter, as a resource with specific capabilities that the organization needs. And he is managing Marty with the same combination of incentive and implied threat that makes the relationship function as long as both parties find it mutually beneficial. The character who most directly embodies the cartel's capacity for violence in Ozark is not Navarro himself, but his nephew, Javi, who arrives in the third season as a younger, more volatile, less strategically patient version of his uncle, and who immediately begins destabilizing every relationship the Byrdes have carefully cultivated. Javi kills Helen Pierce, the cartel's lawyer and the Byrdes' primary handler, in front of Marty and Wendy at the end of the third season, in a scene that functions as the show's announcement that the rules of the game have changed, and that the careful, financially mediated world the Byrdes have been operating in is not as stable as they believed. He kills her not for any strategic reason, but as a demonstration, a statement that he is now in charge, and that the previous arrangements are subject to his review. It is the Tuco Salamanca move, the performance of extreme violence as a power assertion, deployed in a context that had previously been organized around the Gus Fring model of controlled, invisible pressure. And the Byrdes, who are extremely good at navigating the Gus Fring model, have no adequate response to the Tuco model. They can manage financial pressure. They cannot manage someone who is willing to shoot their lawyer in the face at an airport as a way of saying hello. What both shows understand about antagonists, and what makes the best of them so much more interesting than the villains of ordinary crime drama, is that the most effective antagonists are not the ones who pose the most obvious physical threat. They are the ones who reveal something about the protagonist that the protagonist did not know about themselves. Gus Fring revealed to Walter White that his ego, which he had always experienced as a strength, was also his most exploitable vulnerability. The cartel revealed to Marty Byrde that his belief in the sufficiency of financial solutions was a form of magical thinking in a world where some problems do not have financial solutions. Tuco revealed to Walter that performing violence without strategic patience is eventually self-defeating. Javi revealed to the Byrdes that the controlled, institutional version of criminal power they had learned to navigate was only one version of the thing, and that the other version, the raw, volatile, personal version, was not something their skill set prepared them for. There is a specific moment in the fourth season of Ozark that crystallizes what the show has been saying about power across its entire run, and it comes in an unexpected form. Darlene Snell, the elderly local heroin producer who has been a recurring presence since the first season, shoots Javi Navarro in her kitchen. She does it without warning, without strategic planning, without any of the careful calculation that the Byrdes bring to every decision. She does it because Javi has been disrespectful to her, and because she is a woman who responds to disrespect with violence, in the same reflexive way that other people respond to it with complaint or withdrawal. The shooting is almost absurd in its simplicity. Here is the representative of a billion-dollar international drug cartel, killed in a farmhouse kitchen by a woman in her 60s who makes heroin in rural Missouri because the moment called for it, and she had a shotgun. And the absurdity is the point. All the strategic sophistication, all the financial architecture, all the careful management of relationships and institutions and political figures that both the Byrdes and the cartel have invested in across 4 seasons. And it ends, for Javi, at the hands of someone who was not playing any of those games. Real power, the show keeps insisting, is not always the most sophisticated power. Sometimes, it is simply the willingness to act when everyone else is calculating. Breaking Bad makes a version of the same argument through Walter's eventual defeat of Gus. Gus is smarter than Walter. He is more patient. He has more resources and more experience, and a more thoroughly developed operation. He loses because Walter is willing to go further than Gus anticipated. To form alliances Gus considered beneath consideration. To use a dying man in a wheelchair as a weapon, because the dying man's hatred of Gus was the one force in Gus's world that Gus had not figured out how to neutralize. Walter wins not through superior strategy, but through superior recklessness. Through the willingness to risk everything on a plan that should not have worked, and that worked anyway. Because Gus, for all his sophistication, had not fully accounted for how far a desperate and egomaniacal man will go when the alternative is losing. The antagonists in both shows are defeated not because the protagonists outthink them, but because the protagonists are willing to do things that people with more to lose would not do. Which is, in its own way, the show's darkest observation about power. The most dangerous person in any room is not the most sophisticated one. It is the one with the least left to protect. Both shows use their antagonists to draw the outer boundaries of the world their protagonists inhabit, to show what the fully realized version of the thing Walter and Marty are building actually looks like when it has been running for 20 years rather than 2. Gus Fring is what Walter might have become if he had patience and discipline and the ability to subordinate his ego to the requirements of the operation. Omar Navarro is what Marty might have become if he had been born into the cartel rather than recruited into it. A man who wants out of the life he was built for, but cannot find the door. The antagonists are mirrors. They show the protagonists what they are becoming, and the protagonists, in their different ways, look into those mirrors and choose to see something other than what is actually reflected. Walter looks at Gus and sees an obstacle. Marty looks at Navarro and sees a negotiating partner. Neither of them looks at the mirror and sees themselves. That refusal to see themselves clearly, in the faces of the people most like them, is the thing that makes both of them, in the end, as tragic as the antagonists they spent their shows fighting against. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The antagonists drew the boundaries of both worlds and revealed what the men at the center were actually becoming. But there is a specific moment in each show where the pretense finally dropped completely, and that moment of collapse is what comes next. Section 7. The Moral Collapse. The exact episode in each show where the main character stopped pretending to be good. There is a specific kind of moment in long-form television drama that critics and viewers tend to argue about for years after a show ends. The moment when a protagonist crosses a line so definitive, so irreversible, that the question of whether they might still find their way back to something recognizable as decency is finally closed. Not every show has one of these moments. Some shows let their protagonists degrade gradually, in increments so small that no single episode can be identified as the turning point. But Breaking Bad and Ozark both have one. Both shows contain a specific moment where the main character stops performing goodness and reveals, without any further possibility of denial, what they have actually become. The moments are different in texture and in dramatic register, but they are doing the same thing. They are the shows closing the door on the version of their protagonist that the audience had been invited, however reluctantly, to root for. After these moments, rooting for Walter White or Marty Byrde is no longer a morally neutral act. The shows have made that explicit. Whatever sympathy the audience extends from this point forward is sympathy extended with full knowledge of what it is being extended toward. For Breaking Bad, that moment arrives in the 4th season episode, Cornered. It is not the most violent episode of the series. It does not contain a murder or an explosion or any of the more obviously dramatic events that the show uses elsewhere to mark Walter's descent. It is a quieter moment, and the quietness is what makes it so devastating. Skylar has just told Walter that she is frightened. She has said, plainly, that she does not know what to do, that the situation they are in is beyond anything she knows how to manage, that she is scared of what Walter has become and scared of what is going to happen to their family. She is reaching out to him, not as a critic or an adversary, but as a frightened person, asking the person she is supposed to be closest to for some acknowledgement of the reality they are both living inside. And Walter, rather than receiving this, rather than responding to his wife's fear with anything resembling the tenderness or honesty that the moment is asking for, looks at her and says, "I am the danger." He says a man opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? He says, "I am the one who knocks." He delivers these lines with the specific, cold pride of a man who has just decided in that moment that his wife's fear is not a call for connection, but an insult to his power. He is not reassuring her. He is correcting her. He is telling her that she has misunderstood the situation, that she should not be afraid of what might happen to them, but should instead be in awe of what Walter White has become. The speech is the most naked expression of his ego in the entire series. It is the moment the cancer patient justification, the family provision justification. Every justification he has been carrying since the pilot falls away completely. And what is left is just a man who has found a version of himself he likes and is no longer interested in pretending otherwise. For Ozark, the moment of moral collapse is both more gradual and more specific, and it arrives in the 3rd season, in the sequence surrounding Ben Davis's death. The exact pivot is not the moment Wendy makes the call. It is the moment Marty finds out she made it and does nothing. He absorbs the information that his wife told a cartel fixer where to find her brother, that she traded Ben's life for the continuation of the operation. And he does not leave. He does not go to the authorities. He does not even, in any sustained way, confront Wendy with the moral weight of what she has done. He processes it. He files it. He continues. The marriage continues. The operation continues. And Marty's continuation, his choice to keep going in full knowledge of what his wife has done and what his presence in the operation makes possible, is the moment Ozark closes the door on any remaining reading of Marty Byrde as a man who is in this situation reluctantly, who is doing what he has to do, who would stop if he could find a way to stop. He could have stopped here. He did not. The stopping was available, and he chose the operation instead. From this point forward, everything the Byrdes do carries the full weight of that choice. They are not reluctant participants anymore. They are architects. The difference between these two moments of moral collapse reflects everything that is different about these two shows and what they believe about human nature. Walter White's collapse is loud and proud and self-announcing. He tells his wife he is the danger. He does not hide it. He has arrived at the version of himself he was always moving toward, and he is not ashamed of it. He wants credit for it. He wants recognition. His moral collapse is, in its own way, a kind of achievement in his internal accounting. The moment he finally stopped pretending to be less than he believed himself to be. Marty Byrde's collapse is quiet and administrative. He receives terrible information and incorporates it into his operating picture and moves on. There is no speech. There is no pride. There is just the continuation of the machine, absorbing another horror, adjusting its parameters, running the next calculation. Walter collapsed into his worst self dramatically because drama was always his preferred register. Marty collapsed into his worst self efficiently because efficiency was always his. Both collapses are complete. Both are honest about what the man underneath the justifications actually was. And both, in their different ways, are the shows telling their audiences that the time for comfortable viewing is over. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The moral collapse closed the door on every remaining justification both men had been carrying. While the collapse was happening, though, there were women in both shows who had already seen it coming, and whose clarity cost them more than anyone acknowledged. Section 8. The Women Who Saw Clearly. Marie Schrader, Helen Pierce, and the ones who understood what was happening before anyone else. There is a scene in the 4th season of Breaking Bad that almost nobody quotes when they talk about the show, but that contains, in the space of about 90 seconds, more clarity about what Walter White actually is than almost any other scene in the series. Marie Schrader is sitting in her living room. She has been having a conversation with Skylar that has circled around the truth without landing on it, the way conversations between people who are both protecting something tend to circle. And Marie has just understood, not fully, not with complete information, but with the specific understanding that comes from knowing a person well enough to read the gaps in what they are saying, that something is very wrong. Not wrong in the ordinary way that things go wrong in marriages or families. Wrong in a way that does not have a name yet in Marie's vocabulary, but that her body has already registered as a threat. She looks at her sister. She is not angry yet. She has not yet arrived at the anger that will eventually define her relationship with the Whites in the final season. She is just watching, absorbing, filing, doing the work of a woman who has learned, through years of living adjacent to things she was not supposed to see, that watching carefully and saying nothing is sometimes the only form of power available to you. The scene ends without resolution. The conversation moves on. And Marie Schrader goes back to being a supporting character in a show that is nominally about her brother-in-law, carrying information she does not yet fully have in a body that already knows what the information means. Marie is one of the most undervalued characters in Breaking Bad. And the undervaluation is itself a piece of evidence about how the show distributes its dramatic attention. She is loud and sometimes abrasive, and frequently comic in her presentation, the kind of character that ensemble dramas use to provide tonal relief in scenes that would otherwise be unrelentingly heavy. She shoplifts compulsively, a detail the show introduces early and then largely drops. And the shoplifting is presented often as a quirk or a character note, rather than as the symptom it actually is. The symptom of a woman living with chronic anxiety and a need for control in a life that offers her very little of it. She is married to Hank Schrader, a man she loves and who loves her back in his particular, loud, uncomplicated way, but whose work puts him in constant danger and whose ego requires constant management. She is Skylar's sister, which means she is permanently adjacent to a marriage that is consuming her sister from the inside, while everyone performs normality over the top of the consumption. Marie is surrounded, for 5 seasons, by people who are either actively deceiving her or passively allowing themselves to be deceived. And she is the character who, when the truth finally arrives, responds to it with the least equivocation. When Marie finds out, in the 5th season, what Walter has been doing, and what Skylar has known and for how long. Her response is the most honest emotional response in the entire show. She is not conflicted. She is not calculating. She does not run a cost-benefit analysis or think about the implications for the family's financial situation or wonder what the strategic response should be. She tries to take Holly from Skylar. She drives home in a state that is beyond anger, past the point where anger is an adequate description of what is happening in her body. She calls Hank and tells him everything she knows. She aligns herself, immediately and without reservation, with the side of the law and the side of what is right. Not because she is naive about the consequences, but because she is constitutionally incapable of the kind of sustained moral accommodation that Skylar has been performing for years. Marie sees clearly. She has always seen clearly. The thing that has prevented her from acting on what she saw was not confusion, but the absence of complete information. The moment the information arrived, she acted. No hesitation, no strategic pause, just the immediate, unmediated response of a person whose moral compass has been functioning correctly the entire time, and who has simply been waiting for the moment when the needle had something definitive to point at. This is what makes Marie Schrader, in the final accounting, one of the most morally coherent characters in either show. She is not a hero. She is not positioned as a hero. She does not get a dramatic arc of growth or transformation. She is just a woman who knew what was right and did it when she could, and was forced to watch for years before she could, while the people around her chose wrong in elaborate and well-justified ways. Her clarity is presented by the show as almost an inconvenience, a social difficulty, the quality that makes her the family member nobody quite wants to have a serious conversation with. And the fact that her clarity is the quality the show most consistently treats as a mild problem. While Walter's ego and Skylar's accommodation and Hank's obliviousness are treated as dramatically rich and complex, is itself a statement about how the show distributes its sympathy. Marie is right. She is right from the beginning to the end. And being right in Breaking Bad is not the same as being interesting, which is its own quiet indictment of what the show was asking its audience to value. Helen Pierce in Ozark is a different kind of clarity entirely, and the difference is important. Where Marie's clarity is moral, Helen's is professional. She is the cartel's lawyer, the interface between the Navarro organization and the legitimate legal and financial systems it needs to operate within. And she is extraordinarily good at her job, in the specific way that people who have completely subordinated their ethical concerns to their professional identity are good at their jobs. She sees clearly, not because she has a functioning moral compass, but because she has replaced her moral compass with a strategic one. She understands what is happening around the Byrdes faster and more completely than almost anyone else in the show. She understands Wendy's ambition before Wendy has fully articulated it to herself. She understands Marty's vulnerabilities before Marty has acknowledged them. She reads situations with the cold precision of someone who has learned that feelings are data points rather than guides, that other people's emotions are information to be processed, rather than experiences to be shared. What makes Helen interesting as a character, and what distinguishes her from a straightforward villain, is that her clarity ultimately cannot save her. She sees everything. She understands the dynamics of the Byrde operation more thoroughly than any other outside party. She identifies Wendy's growing power within the organization before the cartel does. She recognizes that the Byrdes are becoming more valuable to Navarro than she is, and she begins, carefully and methodically, to construct a response to that threat. She is doing exactly what her skill set trained her to do, identifying a danger and developing a strategy to address it. And she is killed anyway. Shot at an airport by Javi Navarro on Navarro's orders, because the world she is operating in has shifted underneath her in ways that her clarity, for all its sophistication, did not fully account for. She saw the birds clearly. She did not see Javi clearly enough. She understood the institutional cartel. She underestimated the personal one. Her death is the show's statement that clarity without the right object is just sophisticated blindness. She was looking at everything except the thing that killed her. Together, Marie and Helen represent the two available forms of female clarity in these shows, and what each form costs its possessor. Marie's moral clarity cost her years of being treated as the difficult one, the one who pushed too hard, the one whose emotional responses were sized wrongly for the situations she was responding to. When she was finally vindicated, when the truth arrived and her reading of it turned out to have been correct all along, there was no satisfaction in it, because the truth had destroyed everything she loved. Her husband died. Her sister's marriage collapsed. The family she had spent her life embedded in was gone. Being right did not save anything. It just gave her a clear view of the wreckage. Helen's professional clarity cost her the capacity for the kind of genuine human connection that might have given her information her strategic mind could not access. She knew what people were doing. She did not always know what they were feeling. And in a world where Wendy Byrde's feelings were reorganizing the power structure of a billion-dollar criminal enterprise, that gap in her knowledge was fatal. Both women saw more clearly than the men at the center of their respective shows. Both women paid for seeing clearly, in different currencies and with different outcomes. And both of them, in their different ways, are the show's acknowledgement that clarity is not the same as power. That understanding what is happening is not the same as being able to change it. And that the women who see most clearly in stories organized around men who refuse to see themselves are often the ones who end up paying the highest price for the vision that nobody else wanted to acknowledge they had. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The women who saw clearly were never given the power to change what they saw in time to matter. All that remained after their clarity was the final question both shows had been building toward, which is how it ends, and what the ending was willing to say. Section 9. The Endings. What Vince Gilligan chose, what Jason Bateman chose, and what the difference means. There is a moment in the final episode of Breaking Bad, Felina, that the show has been building toward for 5 seasons, and that arrives with the specific weight of something that was always going to happen, and that still, when it finally does, lands harder than you expected. Walter White is in the basement of a white supremacist compound in the New Mexico desert. He has built a remote-controlled machine gun in the trunk of a car. He has poisoned the leader of the compound with ricin. He has said goodbye, in his way, to his wife and his daughter and his son. Goodbye being perhaps too generous a word for what those conversations actually were, which were more like confessions delivered to people who did not ask for them and could not use them. He has transferred the last of his money to his son through a legal mechanism that will reach Flynn after Walter is dead. He has done everything he came back to New Mexico to do. And now he is in the basement of the compound, and Jesse Pinkman is there. And Jesse is not going to kill him, even though Walter has put the gun in Jesse's hand and told him to. Because Jesse has understood something in that moment that Walter has not quite caught up to yet. Jesse is free. Whatever Walter does next, Jesse is already free. He drops the gun. He gets in a car. He drives through the fence. He screams. Walter watches him go. And then Walter walks alone through the compound, past the bodies, into the meth lab. And he runs his hand along the equipment with the specific tenderness of a man saying goodbye to the only place he ever fully belonged. And then he falls. The bullet wound he sustained during the machine gun sequence, a wound he did not notice in the chaos, has been bleeding internally. He falls onto the floor of the meth lab. The police arrive. Walter White dies on the floor of the thing he built, alone, looking up at the lights, with an expression on his face that is closer to peace than anything we have seen from him in years. Vince Gilligan made a specific choice with that ending, and the choice has been discussed and debated since the episode aired in 2013. He chose to give Walter White a death that was, in its own dark way, complete. Walter got to fix some of what he had broken. Not all of it, not most of it, but some. He got to say something true to Skylar. He got to provide for his family. He got to free Jesse. He got to die in the place that mattered most to him, doing the thing he was best at, on his own terms, rather than in a prison cell or at the hands of someone else. Gilligan has said in interviews that he went back and forth on the ending for a long time, that he considered darker outcomes, that he considered Jesse killing Walter, or Walter being arrested, or Walter surviving to face trial. He settled on this ending because he felt that Walter had already been punished in the ways that mattered most, that the loss of his family and his identity and everyone he had claimed to love was punishment enough, and that killing him in the lab was both honest and, in a specific, limited sense, merciful. It is not a redemption. Gilligan has been clear about that. Walter does not become a good man in the final episode. He becomes an honest one, briefly, at the end. And the honesty costs him nothing, because he is already dying. But the ending gives the audience something to hold on to. A shape, a conclusion. The satisfying formal closure of a story that has been told with extraordinary craft, and that deserves, in Gilligan's view, an ending that honors the craft. Ozark ends differently in almost every way that an ending can be different, and the difference is a statement. The final episode of Ozark, a feature-length conclusion to the 4th season, does not give Marty and Wendy Byrde the equivalent of Walter's lab floor. It does not give them death or prison or any of the formal punishments that the narrative logic of crime drama usually delivers to its protagonists by the final hour. It gives them something harder to process, and in some ways more honest about how the world actually works for people with the Byrde's particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness and financial sophistication. It gives them continuation. The FBI agent who has been building a case against them is killed in a car accident that is arranged, it is heavily implied, by the cartel. The political relationships Wendy has cultivated pay off in ways that insulate the family from prosecution. The foundation continues. The money continues. Marty and Wendy Byrde, at the end of 4 seasons of murder and money laundering and the systematic destruction of almost everyone who got close to them, are still standing. They are in their car together at the end, driving, and the camera pulls back, and the lake is visible, and the show ends without the formal closure that Breaking Bad provided. Jason Bateman, who directed the final episode, has said in interviews that the ending was chosen deliberately to resist the audience's desire for punishment. He has said that the show was always interested in the question of what happens to people like the Byrdes in a world organized around the protection of money and political connection, and that the honest answer to that question is that people like the Byrdes often do not get punished. The system that should punish them is frequently the system they have learned to operate. The institutions that should hold them accountable are frequently the institutions they have cultivated. Giving them a Breaking Bad ending, a death or an arrest or a formal reckoning, would have been dramatically satisfying and thematically dishonest. The Ozark ending is dramatically uncomfortable and thematically honest. It says that the world the Byrdes built is not a world that automatically corrects itself. It says that intelligence and money and political connection are genuinely protective in ways that moral failure alone cannot overcome. It says that the story does not always end with the criminal in handcuffs or on the floor of their lab. Sometimes the story ends with them in their car, driving, the lake behind them, everything still intact. The difference between these two endings is the difference between what the two shows believed about justice and about the relationship between narrative and reality. Breaking Bad believed in the satisfying shape of tragedy. It believed that a story about a man who destroys everything he touches should end with the man destroyed, and that the destruction should be earned and specific and meaningful, rather than arbitrary. Walter dies having done a few true things at the end, and the dying is the price of having done so many false things before. The ending is moral without being moralistic. It does not preach. It simply closes the shape that was opened in the pilot, the man in his underwear in the desert, and brings it to rest in the lab where it always belonged. Ozark believed in the unsatisfying shape of reality. It believed that a story about people who are very good at surviving should probably end with them surviving, because the alternative would be a lie dressed up as justice. The Byrdes continue because people like the Byrdes continue. The lake is still there. The car is still moving. The story, the show implies, does not end because the camera stopped. It just goes on without us. Both choices are defensible. Both are honest to their respective shows. And the fact that Breaking Bad's ending is almost universally celebrated while Ozark's is more divisive tells you something about what audiences want from crime drama that is worth sitting with. They want punishment. They want the formal reckoning. They want Walter on the lab floor and Jesse driving through the fence, because those images confirm that the moral universe of the story is organized the way we want the moral universe of reality to be organized, around consequences that are proportionate to choices. Ozark refused to confirm that. It looked at its audience and said the world does not work the way you want it to, and the Byrdes are the proof of it. And then it ended, and left the audience with the discomfort of a truth that does not resolve. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The ending said everything about what each show ultimately believed about justice and the distance between narrative and reality. One question remains, the one this whole video was really asking, and the answer is next. Section 10. The verdict. Which show understood its own darkness better, and what both of them were really about? There is a question that sits underneath every comparison of Breaking Bad and Ozark that nobody quite asks directly, but that every conversation about the two shows is really trying to answer. The question is not which show was better written, or better acted, or more formally accomplished, although those are interesting questions with defensible answers. The question is, which show was more honest? Honest about what it was doing. Honest about the kind of man it had placed at its center. Honest about what it was asking its audience to feel about that man and why. Honest about the world it was depicting and what that world's relationship to the actual world might be. Because both shows were doing something that prestige drama has been doing since the form matured in the early 2000s, which is asking an audience to spend significant time inside the perspective of a man who does terrible things. And the ethical weight of that ask depends entirely on whether the show understands what it is doing and is honest about it. A show that places you inside a monster's perspective and knows it is doing that, and uses the placement to tell you something true about monsters and about the human capacity for self-deception, is doing something valuable. A show that places you inside a monster's perspective and mistakes the monster for a hero, or allows the audience to make that mistake without correction, is doing something considerably more dangerous. Breaking Bad knew exactly what it was doing. This is the first and most important thing to say about it in any comparison with Ozark. Vince Gilligan has said, in interviews given before the show even finished airing, that his intention from the beginning was to take a character the audience liked and turn him into a villain. To perform the transformation so gradually and so carefully that the audience would not notice it happening until they were already complicit in rooting for someone they should have been horrified by. He designed the show as a trap. The audience was supposed to enjoy Walter's early victories, supposed to feel the satisfaction of watching an undervalued man finally express his full capability, supposed to feel the excitement of the cooking and the plotting and the outsmarting of people who underestimated him. And then, gradually, the show was supposed to make the audience uncomfortable with those feelings, supposed to make them realize that the excitement they had been feeling was the excitement of watching someone destroy everything around him for the sake of his own ego, and that their enjoyment of it made them participants in the same moral failure they were watching. Breaking Bad is a show about Walter White. It is also a show about the audience watching Walter White. The two subjects are inseparable. The trap was always for the viewer as much as for the characters inside it. This is why the ending works the way it does. When Walter tells Skyler in the penultimate episode that he did it for himself, that he liked it, that he was good at it, and it made him feel alive, he is also telling the audience that the thing they enjoyed watching, the cooking and the plotting and the winning, was the same thing. They liked it too. They felt alive watching it. They were good at rooting for him, and it felt satisfying in ways they could not always justify. Walter's confession is not just his confession. It is an invitation for the audience to make their own. Gilligan designed every element of the final season to make this reckoning unavoidable. The deaths, the collateral damage, the children, Jesse's suffering, the systematic destruction of every relationship Walter had ever claimed to value. By the time Walter is on the lab floor, the audience has been forced to account for what their investment in him produced, not just what Walter's choices produced, what the audience's enjoyment of those choices produced. That is the full scope of what Breaking Bad was doing. It is a show about a man who destroyed everything, and a mirror held up to the people who watched him do it, and felt, at least some of the time, that he was right to. Ozark understood its darkness differently, and the understanding was in some ways more sociological, and in some ways less personal. Where Breaking Bad was interested in the interior of one man, and what that interior revealed about human nature broadly, Ozark was interested in the system, in the structures, in the way that money and political connection and institutional access create a world in which certain people are effectively protected from the consequences of their choices, while other people without those resources, pay the full price for much smaller transgressions. Ruth Langmore dies. Wendy Byrde gives a speech at a political fundraiser. The contrast is not accidental. It is the show's central argument, stated in the most direct possible terms. The system that is supposed to deliver justice is the same system that the Byrdes have spent 4 seasons learning to operate. And the people who cannot operate that system, The Ruths and the Wyatts and the Darlenes are the people who end up dead or broken or simply erased from the story, while the operators continue. This is a real and important thing to say about the world. It is true in ways that crime drama rarely acknowledges with this degree of directness. Most crime shows, even the prestige ones, maintain a residual faith in institutional justice, a belief that the system, for all its flaws, eventually delivers something resembling a fair outcome to the people who deserve it. Ozark does not share that faith. It looks at the system and sees a mechanism that has been captured by the people with the resources to capture it. And it follows that observation to its logical conclusion, which is that the Byrdes, having captured the mechanism, are not going to be delivered to justice by it. They are going to be protected by it. And the ending, the car driving away from the lake, is the honest image of that protection. It is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be uncomfortable. The discomfort is the point. But here is where the comparison becomes genuinely interesting, and where the question of which show understood its own darkness better gets complicated in ways that a simple verdict cannot resolve. Ozark's sociological honesty came at a cost that Breaking Bad did not pay. Because Ozark, in its commitment to depicting a world in which the Byrdes survive and the Ruths do not, sometimes lost track of the moral weight of what it was asking the audience to watch. The show was so committed to the Byrdes' perspective, so thoroughly organized around their intelligence and their capability, and the specific satisfaction of watching them outmaneuver one obstacle after another, that it occasionally forgot to make the audience feel the cost of what the Byrdes were doing to the people around them. Ruth's death lands hard. But it lands hard partly because Julia Garner's performance across 4 seasons has been so extraordinary that the audience cannot help but feel it. The show earned that grief almost despite itself, through the force of a performance, rather than through the consistent moral architecture that Breaking Bad used to make every death feel like a verdict. Breaking Bad never lost track of the moral weight. Every death in Breaking Bad cost something. Not just dramatically, morally. The show makes you feel the specific human loss of every person Walter's choices eliminate. From Crazy 8 in the early episodes, the young man Walter and Jesse hold captive in Jesse's basement, and whom Walter eventually strangles with a bike lock after making a list of pros and cons about whether to kill him, to Andrea, shot on her own porch while Jesse watches from a van. Each death is a reckoning. Each death adds to the score that Walter's body, and the audience's conscience, is being asked to carry. By the time Walter dies in the lab, the weight of every preceding death is in the room with him. The show has not let any of it go. It has been accumulating deliberately, with the specific intention of making the final image as heavy as possible. Walter on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone his choices have destroyed. The image works because the show did the moral accounting along the way. Nothing was discounted. Nothing was written off. This is the final verdict, and it comes in 2 parts. Breaking Bad was the more formally perfect show. It was more tightly constructed, more consistent in its moral vision, more rigorous in its refusal to let the audience off the hook for their own enjoyment of Walter's story. It understood what it was doing at every level, from the individual scene to the overall shape of the narrative, and it executed that understanding with a craft and a patience that is almost unmatched in the history of the form. It is the show that knew it was a mirror and never stopped being one, even when being a mirror was uncomfortable, and even when the audience would have preferred a window. Ozark was the more ambitious show in certain respects, and the less disciplined one in others. It was trying to say something true about the American class system, and about the way money and access protect certain people from consequences that destroy other people. And what it was trying to say was worth saying. But it did not always maintain the discipline required to say it clearly. It let the Byrdes be too enjoyable for too long, without consistently foregrounding the cost of their enjoyment. It trusted the system critique to do moral work that the emotional architecture of the show sometimes undercut. It was a show that had important things to say and said them intermittently, in between seasons of being extremely entertaining, in ways that occasionally worked against its own argument. What both shows were really about, underneath the meth and the money laundering and the cartel and the DEA, was the same thing. They were about the American belief that intelligence and capability and the willingness to do what others will not do are sufficient justification for almost any choice. Walter White believed this. Marty Byrde believed this. The belief is not unique to them. It is embedded in the specific texture of American ambition, in the mythology of the self-made man, in the cultural conviction that extraordinary people operate by different rules, and that the extraordinary results they produce retroactively justify the extraordinary means they use to produce them. Both shows took this belief seriously enough to follow it to its conclusion. The conclusion, in Breaking Bad, was a man alone on a lab floor, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had used his intelligence to destroy. The conclusion in Ozark was a couple in a car, still moving, still surviving, still protected by the system they had learned to operate. The wreckage invisible behind them, because the wreckage had been left with people who did not have a car to drive away in. Both conclusions are true. Both are honest. One of them is more comfortable than the other, and the comfort is not a point in its favor. The most important thing either show did was refuse, in its own way, to make the belief feel safe. Walter White's intelligence did not save him. Marty Byrde's intelligence saved him from everything except the life he had built with it, which is its own kind of sentence. Two ordinary men, two impossible situations. Two shows that looked at the American mythology of exceptional men doing exceptional things and found, underneath the mythology, the same ordinary darkness that has always been there. The darkness that does not announce itself. The darkness that sits in a crawl space under a house where a family is trying to eat dinner, growing in the quiet, waiting for the floor to give way. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.